Researched, measurable, accountable forecasts of the world's most unpredictable video game company. That was the mission statement I started this channel with nearly 2 years ago. It was a mad idea then, and it's probably still a mad idea now, but I kind of wanted to know, was it even possible to forecast Nintendo? And how accurate is a Nintendo forecast? Like, subscribe, and settle in to a Nintendo forecast deep dive on Nintendo Forecast. But before we get into the review, I should explain what this is all about. When I said I wanted Nintendo Forecast to be for researched, measurable, and accountable forecasts, each word of that mission statement was important. A substantial number of videos on my channel are primarily research videos. I've got videos on all sorts of different Nintendo developers, including a survey of all their developers and specific deep dives on EPD3, EPD8, and EPD9, plus credit analyses for EPD10 and EPD5. I've got deep dives on Intelligent Systems, Bandai Namco, Nintendo Systems, and Nintendo Pictures. I've looked into individuals with a biography video, including for Hidemaru Fujibayashi, and forthcoming deep dive investigations into Shuntoru Furukawa and Yoshiaki Koizumi. I've looked at the directors, I've looked at their finances, I've considered the political and economic context of their decisions, and I've even looked at the cultural aspects in Japan. Despite the title of the channel, I'd say the heartbeat of the channel is in the research-based videos. Okay, but what about measurable? Well, from this research, the idea is to use the research to make a forecast. But, lots of people prognosticate on the internet. That in itself isn't particularly new. What struck me as more interesting, if more risky, was to actually keep a running score. If the channel's going to be called Nintendo Forecast, hopefully the forecast would be of some worth. Now, making flat-out predictions so I can cry "called it" is nearly impossible, but I think a fairer approach is to deal in broad likelihoods, and so I have been categorizing forecasts into 5 broad bands of likelihood. A 10% chance forecast, or very unlikely forecast, is the lowest I will ever give. And I guess really 10% represents a band of probability from about 0 to 20% in my estimation. I don't have a 0% band because unless something is so impossible that it's not even worth talking about, there's always a chance of something changing. Then I have 30%, 50%, 70%, and 90% bands as well. With this structure, I felt I could give a much fairer sense of my judgments of likelihoods. Effectively, these numbers would represent my confidence of a particular outcome. Now, I've done the percentages for nearly 2 years. Some people really like this, many people are indifferent, and a small number, a tiny number I think, but still some, didn't enjoy them at all. Sometimes I've seen people criticizing the channel and saying that the numbers are just pulled out of the air, or even from less salubrious locales, to which I have to say, well, yeah, duh. I mean, I don't actually have a crystal ball. I'm not an insider, and I don't even follow the rumor mill very closely. Multiple times in the comments, people will tell me that the Pokemon Gigaleak or some other rumor contradicts something I've said. I've talked about why I don't put enormous stock in rumors in other videos, and while I do talk about them, and sometimes they even influence my forecasting, any individual number is literally just my best guess based on the research I've done. There are times I've been bang on the money and times when I've been spectacularly wrong. There have been a few times I've come near and slipped up. I did a video in which I talked about a Nintendo music service, but didn't remember to put a percentage likelihood on it. I had a video part scripted on a sound clock patent, but figured I didn't need to be in any rush to do it. I also had a draft script which gave even odds to an Endless Ocean game by the end of 2025, but there wasn't really enough there for a full video. However, the point isn't really any individual forecast, but trying to get to a point where, broadly speaking, if I say something is 30% likely, then there's a 30% chance I'll be right, and if I say something is 90% accurate, then there is a 90% chance I'll be. Of course, this builds in the expectation that if I'm saying something is 30% likely, I will probably be wrong 70% of the time. And if I was saying something is 90% likely, there is still the 10% chance that I will not be correct with the forecast. And that's where the accountable comes in, because with over 200 videos on the channel and with 403 specific forecasts up to the end of 2024, 137 of which can now be assessed to see how accurate or inaccurate they were, it's time to actually look and see how effective the channel has been. One thing I should say is that if I make a forecast, it's not like I can never make another on the same topic. If the facts on the ground change, I may the following week forecast something the complete opposite of what I've just said, but the original forecast remains to me as valid as does the new one, and I will assess both in due course. This means that some of these, with the benefit of hindsight, look clearly mad as a box of frogs, and some of them were even mad at the time, but some of them simply reflected the best wisdom I could muster a year or more ago when the landscape of the Nintendo commentary scene looked quite different. I reviewed my progress last in April of 2024, and while I don't have a definitive schedule for reviews, it really depends on how much or how little Nintendo reveal in a given period as to whether an update would be meaningful. The new year feels like a decent time for an update. I think it's likely I'll reassess within this year, but I'm not going to set a strict time frame for it, just when it seems an interesting point to do so. Incidentally, a draft of this video has been on Patreon for a couple of weeks, and there is quite a bit of exclusive content available there now on the various tiers, so if you do enjoy the channel, please do consider checking it out. So when I reviewed in April, I didn't necessarily have enough forecasts that had come in to be able to say too much with accuracy. That makes the headline percentages a bit hit and miss. So my 90% forecasts were coming in 100% of the time, which was okay, but my 70% forecasts were also coming in 100% of the time. My 50% forecasts coming in 37.5% of the time, my 30% forecasts 33% of the time, and my 10% forecasts were coming in 25% of the time. But given that I only had 4 10% judgments to actually assess, that probably didn't mean an awful lot. The thing is, a lot of these forecasts necessitate a longer time frame to really judge, and so it's not always possible within a few months, or even still within a couple of years, to actually say what the truth is. However, enough time has passed and I've released enough videos consistently that up until the end of 2024, I have 403 forecasts on my list and 137 that I can now assess. This is from a quick review of my prior videos. A word of caution, it is possible that I've missed the odd forecast here and there. I tried to go through everything, but equally I try not to focus on the forecasts overmuch when making regular videos. If I was recording them obsessively, I feel like it would be too tempting to start overthinking them. The point is that these are the best judgments that I can make in the moment based on the evidence that I'm looking at, and it would sort of ruin the experiment if I was tracking them too much as I go. I know some people want a running tally, and that's reasonable, but I'm not sure for me as a forecaster, it's actually enormously helpful. At the end of the video, though, I will discuss some of the solutions to some of these issues that I've raised going forward. For now, though, let's review each category in turn. Are my 10% forecasts right 10% of the time? Are my 50% forecasts right 50% of the time? And so on. So of the calls I've made with 90% certainty, 14 of them can now be assessed. 12 have come to pass. 2 did not. You can see on screen the scroll of the different forecasts I made and how they wound up. That's 12 out of 14, which as a percentage is 86%. This is well within the 80% to 100% band and only 4% from being bang on target, so I have to say I am fairly pleased with this one. Okay, let's talk then about the 70% calls. I made 20 different calls. 15 happened, 5 did not. I have counted the playtest game as a digital exclusive game by the end of 2024, since it was, at the end of the day, available to Nintendo fans, albeit on a very limited basis. That gives us 75%. Still, reasonably close and well within the 60 to 80% overall band I was shooting for, but if you don't think the playtest game counts, then my score actually comes to bang on 70% for the 70%. For the 50% category, I made 29 calls that can be assessed. Out of these, 13 calls came to pass and 16 definitely did not. That gives me a percentage success rate of 45%. One that I did wonder about is the forecast of an Animal Crossing game or spin-off by the end of 2026. Does the purchase version of Pocket Camp count? I'm saying no because it's not an original game, but you could make the same argument for Wii U to Switch ports. It's still a new product in Animal Crossing. Another interesting one is the forecast for 3 more games in the Switch's life to top 5 million sales after mid 2023. But of course, only Super Mario Bros. Wonder has currently passed the 5 million threshold, and Pokemon Legends ZA has not even released. For the 30% category, there were a total of 36 forecasts. I had 13 calls that came off and 23 that did not, giving me a percentage of 35%, which again is very close to the target. One that I went back and forth on is the forecast of cross-gen titles in the June 2023 Direct, but I realised that with the backward compatibility of the console, they are all effectively cross-gen titles since Nintendo can happily continue selling them. Anyway, if you don't like counting that, the percentage is 33%, so even closer to the target. On the other hand, I didn't count the extra few percent of shares from Monolith Soft as a new acquisition from Nintendo. That seemed a little unfair, as it's not a new company acquisition, although, again, your interpretation may vary. Another ambiguous one is whether Princess Peach Showtime counts as a new IP. I've said yes, as although we've had a Peach title before, it's quite different from this one, and although the character is pre-existing, her particular game this time is not. For the 10% categories, one of my favourites as it's where all the wild and wacky bits of speculation go, I had 36 forecasts. Out of these, 3 have come to pass, 33 have not. That's 8%, so fairly close to the 10% target. And actually there's an argument to be made that the playtest title represents a new IP before the end of 2024, but since it's not on wide release and there remains the potential that it could be skinned into an existing franchise, I'm not quite sure if I can count it, and it may be something that I revise later when we have more clarity on what exactly that is. If we do count it though, that would take me to 11%, so pretty much exactly on the 10% target. All of that is the broad roundup, and I hadn't actually looked at these figures since April, so I didn't know where I would end up. But I have to say, I am actually surprised and quite pleased, because I think not only are these within the broad bands that I was looking to achieve, many of them are very close indeed to the target. Now bear in mind that there are still hundreds of forecasts still to review as information comes in, which could change these figures, and these forecasts will start scrolling on the screen by the end of the video. Clearly, some of these could take years to assess. In fact, one of the issues I generally have is that most forecasts need to take a long-term view, but it makes it hard to really assess them in the medium term. One of the things you really want when assessing something like this is a decent enough sample size to really judge accuracy. And that is one of the reasons why I'm looking to make a few changes. Nothing drastic, nothing that changes any past forecasts, but just a bit of tidying up really. The first tweak I'm looking to make going forward is actually to go from assessing 5 categories to assessing 3. If you think about it, a 90% chance of something happening is the same as a 10% chance of something not happening. A 10% chance of something happening is an implied 90% chance that it won't. The 90% and 10% categories are really two sides of the same coin, and so are the 70% and 30% categories. Now, I'm not going to delete or change or shuffle any past forecasts. Once it goes out, I'm stuck with it, even the right clangers, of which I've had a few. I'm just going to flip the 10% likelihoods that something will happen into 90% chances that they won't when I come to assess, and turn the 30% chances something will happen into 70% chances that they won't as well. By doing this, I now have 3 categories: 90-10, 70-30, and 50-50, and therefore a much bigger sample size, which should therefore give a better idea of my reliability or lack thereof. Not on any individual forecast, of course, but averaged out over the time I'm working on the channel. In fact, if I do this with the ones I've already assessed, I get some quite pleasing results. Of 50 forecasts that were 90-10 calls, my accuracy was 90% to 10% exactly. I was a bit harsh on the 10%, but a bit lax on the 90%, but these balance each other out perfectly. That's a surprise, and of course it could all evaporate when Nintendo makes new announcements, but it's still quite pleasing. And with the 70-30 calls, something similar happens. In fact, with 39 accurate to 18 wrong predictions, that makes my ratio for the 70-30 calls a 68-32 ratio. Not quite smack bang in the middle of the bullseye, but certainly very close. Obviously, this doesn't change the 50-50 forecasts, which are 45 to 55 and evidently my weakest, but then again, they also have the smallest sample size, so who knows. Still, this leads me on to another tweak I'm looking to make. While some people really enjoy this forecasting element of the channel and looking out for the percentages, a lot of people don't pay it much attention. The occasional person, as I've mentioned before, really doesn't like it. Some people find the specificity of a percentage oddly jarring. I know a lot of people don't like that I'm mixing research with my own judgments, and although my rationale is, as I've already explained, I think there is a point here. While I think this video proves that over the long term, my forecasts are decent enough that my judgments aren't completely misleading, that doesn't change the fact that I'm using averages and any individual forecast could easily be a load of old tosh, and of course many of them are. Also, I don't explain my system each time for new viewers to the channel, and I hope there will continue to be new viewers, so it can come off as a little alienating, I think. I've tried making forecasts more prominent with on-screen graphics, but this often makes it worse, plus is a pain in editing. What I'd like to do is move towards natural language that regular channel viewers will recognise as me giving a forecast, but which won't throw anyone who isn't a regular. My thought is that for 90% and 10% calls, I'll just use very likely and very unlikely. And if you watch with subtitles, I will put the percentages next to them in the brackets as well. Occasionally, I'll use these numbers in the videos, but only for videos which are more predictions based anyway, where I might be making quite a few calls, not general observations at the end of research videos where it might seem fairly incongruous with the rest of the video. For 70% and 30% calls, I'll just say fairly likely and fairly unlikely. For the 50-50 calls, I'll probably just say 50-50 or even odds or moderately likely. So, for posterity, here in one video are all the forecasts that I've made so far that have yet to be assessed. Clearly, some of the likelihoods, which in some case were recorded nearly 2 years ago, I wouldn't stand by necessarily. Some flat out contradict each other because I've issued new forecasts over the last 2 years and superseded the old ones. And there's a couple which were, in hindsight, mad even to start with. However, this list is not about what I currently think, but is simply about the list of past forecasts that have yet to be assessed. I will keep this list on my Patreon for anybody who wants to see it, and I will try to keep it updated occasionally, but for reasons I've outlined above, it will be occasional because I don't want to spend too much time focusing on the particular scores and only look at those when it comes time to assess them. By the way, this is probably a good opportunity to mention the debut of the new channel thumbnail. This was created by a talented viewer who is happy to remain nameless, but I think it looks really snazzy, so thank you very much indeed. If you would like to support the channel, then please do like, comment, share, subscribe. The Patreon is below, which, as I say, has lots of cool stuff on it, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.